You're right to be scared of the dark. You know, that feeling you get when the covers are pulled up to your face, and when you're lying in the dark with your eyes open but too afraid to look? That feeling that makes you a child again, holding your breath while you say to yourself, if I don't look, maybe it'll go away. If you muster your courage to stare back at the watcher in the dark, it'll be gone if you're lucky. I'm not. Let me tell you about when my life fell apart. It was 1982. I was in the kitchen. Mom said that there were no such things as monsters. I can hear it now, clear as day. You're too old for that crap. She spoke over her shoulder from the stove. I'd been having nightmares and she couldn't keep waking up in the middle of the night. Work started early and ended late. That's kids' stuff, Johnny. I saw the dark circles under her eyes and the way her face sagged with fatigue. She was working double shifts to make ends meet, and it was wearing her thin as a coin passed through too many hands. I need to rest, she said. She wasn't telling me as much as she was pleading, and even as a kid I could hear the difference. That made my part in it worse. The pain rattled across the burner, and I could smell the sausages browning. It was Sunday, so breakfast was more than Wonder Bread and peanut butter. Granddad sat in the kitchen too. He was drinking his coffee from an off-white mug with a chipped rim. He had a cigarette in his other hand. And when he wasn't taking a drag, his hand was on the table next to his GPCs like he was guarding them. Granddad called them good people's cigarettes. His nose was almost as red as the Marlboros he couldn't afford once he'd been laid off. He coughed his face blue with the effort, but as soon as he could breathe again, the cigarette was back in his mouth. Mom dropped 2 links on my plate from the sizzling pan. When I was your age, I was already working odd jobs to help out. Didn't know what to say, so I kept my mouth shut. And I wasn't keeping my folks up half the night. Granddad rescued me. He knows Tammy, give it a rest. He looked at me and I could see that he was asking for assurance. I was just a kid, but also somehow the fulcrum on which the family's troubles pivoted. Maybe that's not entirely true, but it seemed that way to me. I was a mouth to feed, a not keeping the ends from meeting. Those dark circles, that tired sag that pulled at her mouth. One way or another, life was using Mom up. By stealing her sleep, I was tightening its grip. Shame's heavy, and it bent me just then. Granddad noticed me sag in my chair. Johnny just shook up, he'll be alright. He didn't look so sure, but he gave me a nod anyway. Right? Yeah. I knew I was lying, so did Mom, but she kept her peace and dropped 2 dollops of scrambled egg next to the links on my plate. High cotton. That's what Granddad said about sausage and eggs. I didn't feel it though, not that morning. He used a fork to cut the links into bits and to mix everything together. I usually liked mine separate and made sure no egg touched sausage, but I watched them meet in the middle as though they were best friends. I had lost my appetite somewhere so far off that even the smell of Jimmy Dean couldn't call it back. He watched me scooting my sausages around, took a long pull from his cigarette and winked. His eyes were playful, conspiratorial even. Mom joined us with a plate of her own. Shit, she said suddenly. I forgot the toast. In a moment, she was back with a small plate stacked with 5 or 6 slices of white bread, a bit more burnt than brown. Eat up, she said. I did, one joyless bite at a time. High cotton, that's what Sunday morning meant. A Sunday afternoon was a lazy affair at my house, and this one was no exception. Granddad leafed through old magazines, nodding off now and then. The pages were dog-eared and he'd read the stories before, but he didn't mind. Mom washed her hair in the bathroom sink and took a long nap. I went outside while Mom slept. It was sunny and hot and I decided to poke around in the shed. It was under an old maple and dappled with shade and sun and summer camouflage. The shed was never locked because there was nothing worth stealing. I opened the door and stepped in. It smelled like rust and oil and old wood, and the light that shone through its only window spotlighted the dance and swirl of the dust in the air. I poked around a bit, looking for something, anything, that might take my mind off my mom. The relation. I had a file in one hand and I was wearing away at the head, one of the bolts attaching a beat-up vise to the work tool. Each push gave a raspy sound and the glint of shiny new steel. One push carried my knuckles too far and I scraped them across the sharp edge of the vise. It peeled the skin back and the blood welled up under the curl. I stuck my hand in my mouth and tasted the metallic tang. My knuckles stung and I winced as I ran my tongue over the flap of skin. Then I saw it. In the corner of my eye, I could just make out a shadow blacker than the black against which it stood. 2 long arms with long hands and long fingers that looked more like claws. To me. It's just my imagination. No, it's not, John, my father's voice. My eyes were on the workbench, but I focused on the shadow without looking. It grew, stretching in the dark, raising those long-fingered hands. My breath caught. I dropped the file and it clunked on the wood floor. I forgot about my knuckle. The hair on my arm stood up and I could feel my heart skipping, starting faster, pounding, trying to escape my chest. I was too scared to look at it directly. I thought about running for the door, but the shadow was right there, just beside it. It had long arms. I'd never make it. I edged into the light from the window. Trying my best not to look, I thought that maybe if I just ignored it, it'd go away. But you tell yourself that too, don't you? Late at night, something in me knew better. Something in you does too, I bet. It was moving, inching toward the mostly closed door. And I was pretending not to look, but I took another sideways step into the light. I could feel the sun on my skin. In the light, the darkness deepened. I couldn't make out the shadow anymore, but I knew it was there. It's there. All right, Johnny, don't you doubt it. Now the voice was Granddad's. The door closed with a thud. My chest ached from the effort of keeping my breath in check. I had to do something. I grabbed a hammer, a big heavy one with a painted red wooden handle. You stay away from me. I yelled, I mean it. My words died in my throat. It was there. I could see it now, blacker than black. Getting darker every second, it was creeping closer, sliding like it was on rails. My hand shook and my lower lip began to quiver. White-hot panic burned in my mind and every thought but run. Was smoke in its wake? But I was frozen and my feet wouldn't budge. It stopped at the edge of the light. It slid around the side, staying just beyond the patch of white on the floor. It was close, really close. The light was small, but it was everything. Mom wasn't much on church and she never taught me to pray, but I prayed my heart out that some passing cloud didn't happen by just then. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. I wasn't holding my breath. I was trying to take one and it wouldn't come. We stood like that for a long time. The hammer got heavy and my arms ached, but I didn't dare lower my guard. It was trying to get behind me when the shed door opened. What the hell are you doing? Mom asked. You noticed the wet patch on my jeans. What the hell, John? I mean, she sat there. Lip quivering, hammer held high until she took me by the arm and dragged me out into the yard and the sunlight, and into the house. She was angry about my wet jeans, but I didn't care. Mom was making dinner in the kitchen. Granddad and I were in the living room. He was on the couch. I was on the floor sitting Indian style. He turned off the TV. I wasn't watching anyway. What's wrong, Johnny? He took a long pull and breathed out through his nose. His face was wreathed in blue smoke. I eyed the window. The sun was setting and it would be dark soon. Nothing, I said, trying to guess how long the light would hold, watching the shadows grow across the front yard. Doesn't look like nothing to me, he said. Come up here and talk man to man? I joined him on the couch and he crushed the noob of his cigarette into the ashtray. It was brown glass made to look like amber. What's wrong? He asked, tousling my hair. Nothing. He could see that it was something and the tousling stopped. He caught my eye with a long sideways look, one milky brown eye. Some men think they should keep their troubles to themselves. Not me. A trouble shared is a trouble lesson, I say. He paused for a breath or two and I could hear how bad his lungs were. What's your trouble, Johnny? In the shed, well, it was too ridiculous to even say. Kid stuff. It was Mom's voice in my head. You're too old for that crap. What about the shed? Well, You saw something, didn't you? I nodded. I thought you might. The nightmares. He coughed, one of the really bad ones that doubled him over and brought tears to his eyes. They're not just nightmares, Johnny. He wiped his eyes and his voice was high and tight and wheezy. Some folks are more sensitive. The nightmares let you know when it's around. That got my attention like a slap. What'd you mean? He had recovered and his hand wandered over to the pack of GPCs. Well, some folks see things other folk can't or won't. He had my eye again and I could feel his intensity. You follow me? He fished a cigarette out the pack and held it, unlead, rolling it in his fingers. I guess I said, you're at that age now. That age when either you stop seeing it or start seeing it more than you'd like. The way he said it quickened the hair on the back of my neck. Every follicle was alive and tingling. The shadow, my voice was barely a whisper. Yeah, he said. I was stunned. It was like I'd known a secret that no one else can share. And suddenly I found out that everyone already knows. Granddad knew. He'd seen it too. As real as the shadow had been, this was impossible to believe. You see it too? I asked. He looked at the cigarette in his hand and then back at me. Yeah, really? I asked. He nodded, a slow motion move of his head. You be careful, Johnny, he said. Some things lose their power when you say them aloud. I found out then that this wasn't one of them. It was way worse after he had admitted that it was dangerous. Way worse? I was about to ask more when Mom came in. She didn't want to hear this and I knew it and I couldn't bear to make it harder on her. Dinner, she said, Later, Granddad said. We'll talk about it later. Mom had a double shift the next day and went to bed early. Me and Granddad waited till we were sure she was asleep. I watched the windows like a hawk. It was full dark and the hair on my arms was at attention. He took one last glance at the hall. Then, his voice as low as a cricket's belly, he said, Johnny, you gotta watch out now. Hearing him say it gave me the shivers. Once it knows you can see it, it'll come for me, won't it? I asked, barely able to get the words out. He was having the same trouble, so he nodded. Millions, hell, billions of parents tell their kids that there's nothing in the dark that's not there in the light. You've done it yourself, haven't you? You repeat it until you believe it, or nearly so, and you hope your kids believe it too. But maybe it's you who need to believe. Maybe it's you who need the consolation. Maybe because you know deep down that there are things that go bump in the night. I knew it, and so did Granddad. I'm gonna watch over you tonight. You'll be safe as houses, I promise. That helped a little, but I'm not always going to be here. I shook my head, but he continued. And when I'm not, you'll need to keep watch yourself. You hear me? Yeah, the word was more breath than speech. Good. When the nightmares come on heavy, that's a sign it's around. Why does it? I'm not sure, maybe it feeds on us at night, stealing a little bit of you when you sleep. He lit a new cigarette from the old one and puffed it to life. That's I think it comes for those who can see it, and maybe it ignores them that can't or won't. You know what I mean? I did. Even if Mom saw it, she would convince herself that she hadn't. I said so, and he nodded. Yeah, his tone told me that he wanted to be a little more like Mom. But what can I do? I mean, to stay safe. The light, Johnny, stay in the light. Neither of us could bear to talk about it anymore. There are things you can say in the daylight that you won't dare in the dark. Instead, we watched Hogan's Heroes and Sanford and Son with the volume down low, so as not to wake Mom. Normally, we'd have been laughing, but that night we didn't even crack a smile. It was getting late and Granddad told me to get ready for bed. I had the covers up like a shield. The lamp was on and my room was fairly well lit. The overhead was busted, but it had always been busted, and there was a problem with the wiring. Granddad was in the corner in a battered fabric chair. He was wearing his red and black plaid shirt with the sleeves rolled up, and he had a big silver Rayovac Sportsman with him, the kind that took 2 D-cell batteries. Something about the chrome reminded me of a knight's sword. I felt a lot better with him there. I'll watch over you, said. I tucked my head under the blankets. What I didn't want to see it. I was tired and scared, but my eyes were heavy. At some point, I fell asleep. I woke up suddenly. Granddad was still in the corner, but his flashlight was on and he was shining it under the bed. I sat up and he saw that I was awake. His face was pale as fresh paint and the Rayovac shook in his hand. I could hear the batteries rattle. Don't get out of bed, he said. What? Why? I rubbed my eyes. Still groggy. It's under the bed, Johnny. I was wide awake then. Don't get out the bed, he repeated. He wasn't asking. I jumped to my feet, the saggy mattress bouncing slightly under my weight. What'd you mean? It's under the fucking bed. Don't move. I was 10 years old and I never heard Granddad so much as say shit. This was bad, real bad. I couldn't stay on the bed. No way, no how. So I ran the step or two, the end of the mattress, and jumped for all I was worth. No. Granddad yelled. I traveled too far and too fast and hit the window in midair, flattening the blinds and tangling in them, ripping them from the wall when I fell backward toward the bed. Granddad was off the chair in an old man's flash, but my hand was falling into the shadow even as I tried to stop it. Upside down on the floor, I could see it too, flat as a doormat in the shadow, under the bed. I snatched my hand to my chest as it reached for me, and not even a hair's breadth separated its fingers from mine. It was cold and misty, like my hand in the freezer to get ice. Jesus, Johnny. I'm okay, I said, finding my feet. I hopped up and down like it was Christmas morning. I'm okay. I was yelling, but I didn't know it. Granddad didn't either, but we figured it out when Mom burst through the door. What the hell? She yelled, her bathrobe trailing behind her like a cape. John? Mac? What the hell is going on? Her hands were in her hips and her face was as red as Granddad's nose. She pointed a finger at Granddad. If it had been a gun, he'd have been dead. You? Ouch, he gave me one long pitiful look that said, what can I do? Mom stood her ground like a titan and he trudged into the hall past her, his head down, defeated, worried, afraid. Then it was my turn. You, in the bed. But. Now, what was I supposed to say? That there was a monster under the bed, that I needed Granddad to keep watch. Haven't your kids said the same thing? I picked up the Rayovac and leapt into the bed. Not flounced, not jumped, leapt like Bruce fucking Jenner in the Olympics. When I get home, John, that threat needed no conclusion. She turned and slammed the door, but not before she switched off the lamp. I sat with the flashlight on, and I knew it wouldn't be enough. I was on the tracks tied to the rails, and the train was coming, and there was no hero waiting just off screen to run in and save the day. It was really dark in there, and there wasn't even a light peeking under the door. It was in its element. I could hear Mom giving it to Granddad in the kitchen down the hall, but I couldn't concentrate on the words. My heart was at least as loud as her cursing, and my mouth felt like it'd never known a sip of water. I had the Rayovac in one hand like a spear, and I was shining the light at the edges of the bed, moving frantically from this side to that, from the headboard to my feet and back again. It was waiting, savoring my fear. You know how it does that, don't you? That's when Mom came in. And the instant before the bulb blew up, she saw it and her mouth dropped open and her eyes grew just like they did on Saturday morning cartoons. I heard her take a loud breath, the substance of a scream filling her lungs, but it was black now, and there was a rush of air, and she was gone. She was gone. Gone, I was screaming, tearing at the doorknob, running down the hall toward the light. My socked feet slid on the kitchen floor, and I smashed into the cabinets hard enough to send my head spinning. The Rayovac skittered across the tired, yellow linoleum. Granddad overturned the table. He saw something too, because it was few minutes before I could get him to see me or answer my frantic questions. It had been right behind me in the hall, all the way to the edge of the kitchen. We waited there till morning. That sounds crazy, I know it, but we did even then. Every light in the house was on as we searched my room for Mom. Of course we never found her. Folks think she ran out just like Dad did. That the double shifts and bills and me and Granddad were just too much in the end. We knew better. I knew better. That was 1982, a long time ago. Granddad and me had a hard time of it, and soon enough I was working those odd jobs to make ends meet. They never really did. Not even close. Granddad passed before too long, and I got more help from the state and foster care. The Willis was so bad, and Fred and Rita did as well by me as they could. I sold the house when I turned 18. I've got stacks of bulbs in the kitchen closet. 60 watts, 100 watts, fluorescence, you name it. My lights are all rigged to a master switch in each room too. One flip and everything's lit. I won't have it any other way. When the nightmares come, and they do come, I keep the lights on all night. The Rayovac's been replaced by a Maglite rechargeable, and I keep a Q-beam by the bed just in case. Every room has a few lamps and an overhead. The wiring's like new. I want you to know that when you get that terrible feeling, that feeling of being watched from the dark, you're not alone. And when you pull the blankets up like a shield and slide your head down and pull your feet up, I do too. When you feel it watching from the dark, or pull back a cold hand dangling over the side of the bed. When you feel like a kid and try to tell yourself there's nothing there, but your imagination, even though you know there's something there. There is. Kids go missing all the time, don't they? And sometimes they die in their sleep even though there's nothing wrong with them, and sometimes parents just get up and go when they've had enough. But maybe, just maybe not all those kids ran away, and maybe them that die see something before they do. And sometimes those parents didn't run off when times got hard. And you're right to be afraid of the dark and what's in it. This is a story about something that happened to me a few years back. I haven't told many people, and those who I did tell dismissed me out of hand. So now I come to you, the internet. Sure, most of the people who read this account won't believe me, but I still cling to the hope that someone out there will take me seriously. Maybe someone has had a similar experience. Anyway, that's enough rambling. Here's my story. I grew up in a small town in Restigouche County, New Brunswick. For those of you who don't know, the area is a cool mountainous region of Canada known for its beautiful forests and rivers, and it lives up to its reputation for natural beauty. The rolling hills, golden shores, and lush woods make it a pleasure to explore in the summer. However, being fairly far north, it cools down quite a bit by early autumn, which is when the event I'm about to describe took place. As I said, I grew up in a small, friendly town, and we didn't have much in the way of haunted houses or urban legends. But one town over, a few miles down the road, there was an old Victorian-era mansion that was said to be haunted by the spirit of a woman. Ray had always heard the story growing up, but by the time I was about 12, I had stopped believing in ghosts and other such nonsense. But I'm getting ahead of myself. I should explain the legend as it was told in our area. The spirit was known to local kids as Old Nan, or the Shrieking Woman. Some people who thought it was all bullshit would dismissively call her Screaming Granny, while shaking their heads at the foolish people who believed in her. Now, the details of the story vary depending on who you ask, but here's the most common version. During the 1800s, there was a local outbreak of pneumonia one winter. There were some other sicknesses like colds and flus going as well. It was a cold, snowy year, and everyone spent their days huddled inside. Perfect conditions for a disease to spread. Couple that with the poor hygiene and primitive medicine of the time, and it's no wonder that people started getting sick. The doctor in town in Naples, US, there was only one, was extremely busy treating the sick and trying to slow the spread of the disease. He went up to a large house on the outskirts of town, trekking through the snow and icy winds to check on the family that lived there. Now, the history of this family was tragic enough already. The man who owned the house had died several years earlier of an unknown medical condition. His wife, distraught at losing her beloved so suddenly, had run away to America in the hopes of starting a new life, leaving her 3 young children in the care of her mother. The last anyone heard of her, she was a drunk living in the slums of some American city, though no one can agree which city it was. I should stress that the details of this tale are hard to verify and that I am merely explaining the story as I heard it growing up. Anyway, by the time this outbreak of pneumonia hit, the 3 kids were in the care of their grandmother, a kindly old woman who tried her best to hold what was left of her family together. When the local doctor made his way up to the house, which was outside of the main settlement, he was relieved to find no signs of disease in the family. He explained that due to the high rates of sickness in town, and the difficulty of journeying to their outlying house in such inclement weather, he wouldn't be back for at least a week. He was satisfied that the inhabitants of the house were healthy, and as long as they stayed home, they couldn't contract any disease. Of course, the doctor had neglected to consider that he might have carried the pathogens from his patients in town up to this family. This turned out to be the case, for even though the doctor had not fallen ill himself, he must have been carrying some sort of bacteria or virus when he visited the family on that cold, bleak day. He spent the next week or so working almost without rest to treat the ill and dying in the town, and during that week it snowed every day. It was one of the harshest winters on record. But the doctor kept his word, and as soon as he could, he made his way back up to the old house outside of town where the grandmother and 3 children lived. Apparently it took him 4 hours just to walk through the snow that lay thick upon the road, though at least the blizzard had finally stopped. When the doctor arrived, he knocked on the door. He received no response, so he knocked again, calling out to the old woman. Again, there was no answer, so he let himself in. I don't know if the door was locked or not, but he got in somehow, and what a terrible sight he found. He first walked through the kitchen, seeing utensils and old food strewn about haphazardly. The furniture was in disarray, now very concerned. He made his way into the dining room and gasped in horror there. In her favorite rocker sate the kindly old grandmother, but she was a hideous mockery of her former self, covered in blisters and cysts, with her skin a pale gray color. Her eyes were bulged and glassy, and her nostrils were flared. Perhaps most disturbing, however, was her mouth. Her lower jaw hung open at an impossible angle. Her few remaining teeth, yellowed and worn with age, jutted out of her now bluish and shriveled gums at odd angles. The doctor felt her hand. She was frozen. She had obviously become very ill and passed away, and with no one to tend the fire, the house had become frigid, freezing her disease-riddled corpse. The doctor got up and ran up the stairs screaming for the children. He burst into the nursery to find 2 bluish, unmoving forms. He began to weep as he tried hopelessly to resuscitate one of the children, but was surprised and relieved to find that he actually began to stir. The child was frostbitten and ill, but still clinging to life. His sister was less fortunate. She had frozen almost as solidly as her grandmother. The 3rd child was missing. It is presumed that he tried to go for help in the blizzard and froze to death. On the way, though, since the body was never recovered, no one could be sure. The surviving child was delirious and could not remember where his brother had gone. This one fortunate boy was nursed back to health, and eventually he was adopted by the doctor, who felt immense guilt at having carried the fatal disease to the small family. The old house was never lived in again. Anyway, that's the story as it was told to me in my childhood, and it persists to this day. But I have yet to touch upon my own experience with Old Nun. As I mentioned earlier, I had stopped believing in ghosts, including this one, by the time I was about 12. But later in my teen years, I developed a fascination with the occult and paranormal. I still didn't really believe in any of it, but like many people, I enjoyed being scared. I loved the tingling in my spine when I heard a good horror story. Unfortunately, none of my friends shared my interests. You have to understand that back then, believing in fairy tales was a sign of weakness after a certain age. And though my town was a pretty friendly place overall, some of the young punks would mock or beat up people who they didn't like. My ghost hunting hobby and collection of horror stories made me a bit of an outcast, but I guess there are assholes everywhere. People who will punish those who are different. I didn't so much mind the teasing, but the fact that no one would come along, when I went to check out haunted locations was discouraging. Nevertheless, when I was 16, I decided to go by bus the nearby town, where this supposedly haunted house was. Razzies, I know I'm repeating myself, but I must stress that at heart, I didn't believe in ghosts. I've always been a skeptic, but I did enjoy scouting out creepy, abandoned locations, and a part of me always wanted to find evidence of the supernatural. I guess these days people call it urban exploration. It was a blend of that and half-hearted ghost hunting. Anyway, this would be my first expedition outside of my immediate area. After half an hour, the bus arrived and I got out. Actually, asking anyone for directions. I knew the name of the street the house was on since I'd heard the story 100 times. It was at the end of Birchwood Lane. Besides, I didn't feel like embarrassing myself by asking anyone where the town's haunted house was. And after wandering around the core of the town, what you'd call downtown, were the place not so small and sparsely populated, I saw a street sign marked Birchwood Lane. Following it, I made my way through a few blocks of modern houses, then some older buildings, and eventually the town thinned out entirely, and I found myself walking into the woods. At the edge of the woods, the road, which had been paved up to this point, gave way to a gravel trail. I sighed and pressed onward. I had brought a flashlight with me, but as the sun had not quite gone down, I didn't need it yet. As I continued, the path got more and more uneven, and the sinking sun and increasingly thick foliage above me shrouded the narrow trail in darkness. Before I got the light out, however, the trees thinned out again, and I saw before me a large, dilapidated two-story house. By this time, the day was nothing more than a fading orange glow on the horizon, and the mansion was basically a silhouette. I'll admit I was a bit apprehensive at this point, but it was far too late to turn back. I walked across the overgrown lawn, which was covered not only in tall grass but also shrubs and a few young trees. As I got closer to the house, I could see it more clearly. There was a single door hanging from its hinges in the middle of the facade. The remains of what was once a front porch lay rotting beneath it. Above the door, a small awning bent dangerously downward, looking as if it could give way at any moment. Only one of the pillars designed to support it still stood. The exterior of the house barely had any paint left on it, and what little still remained was chipped and cracked. Most of the windows were shattered. Though only one had been boarded up, the house looked old to be sure, though it didn't look like it had been abandoned for 200 years. If that had been the case, it probably wouldn't have remained standing so intact. A reason that someone must have kept the building in shape for a while, after the old woman had died, and it only fell into disrepair sometime afterward. As I came to the door and climbed up over the remains of the front porch, I felt a chill run down my spine. I felt fear before, but this was different. It was more than fear. It was a feeling of being unwelcome, of not belonging. I dismissed it as paranoia and gave the battered wooden door a push. It's partly open already, but the wood of the door frame was too warped for it to swing freely. I pushed it again harder and heard a loud crack as the rusted hinges broke apart. The whole door lurched and then fell outwards. I had to jump out of the way as it nearly fell on me. I dusted myself off and clambered inside. The sunlight was now gone entirely, and I was extremely wary of tripping over old furniture or holes in the floor. I switched on my flashlight and swept the beam over my surroundings. I was in some sort of large hallway that branched off in several directions. At the end was a staircase. I walked along the corridor and looked into each adjacent room as I went. It was hard to tell what any of these rooms were supposed to be. Each was just a mess of exposed wooden beams, old trash and pieces of the walls fallen onto the floors, and the pervasive smell of mildew. A few books, ruined beyond recognition, lay upon a shelf in one room. There were several broken jars on the floor. I made my way slowly to the staircase and began to climb it. I was nervous as the stairs were old and rotted and creaked loudly under my weight. Carefully, I got up to the top and looked around. The second floor was much like the first, except that it was even more uneven. This did little to comfort me, as I knew that the floor could give way under my feet and send me toppling down 9 feet to the lower floor in a pile of debris. But what can I say? I was a dumb, fearless kid. To me, giving up and going home seemed worse than risking my own neck. It's funny how teens think sometimes. As I explored, I came upon a bathroom. It looked so dated. That may sound weird, especially since the whole house was pretty ancient, but just seeing the old-fashioned pipes, the archaic toilet, and the bathtub on little ornamental legs just seemed so quaint. I was a bit confused when I looked into the bathtub and found dark, reddish stains. While the first thing that popped into my head was the phrase bloodbath, I laughed when I realized that they were probably just rust stains. The next room I entered was truly unnerving. I recognized it almost immediately as the nursery from the story. There were 2 small beds and a small cot. For some reason, the child-sized beds were made up, with moldy, moth-eaten blankets tucked neatly all around them and turned down partly at the top. I guess the last caretaker of the house had just left them like that, but it seemed so eerie to me. It was almost as if someone had just prepared the beds for the kids a few hours ago. The cot, by contrast, was completely bare. Now, if this story is making me sound brave so far, please realize that I really wasn't. I'll admit that I was terrified. The feeling of being unwanted hadn't left me. If anything, it had grown as I explored the house. As I got further from the door, my heart began pounding harder and harder. But as I said, I was determined not to chicken out and leave. I steadied myself and fought the urge to run. In hindsight, I probably shouldn't have. There wasn't much more of interest upstairs, as the other bedrooms were pretty much empty. The furniture had mostly been removed long ago. I spent about another 20 minutes upstairs before heading back to the creaking old staircase and carefully making my way back down. I realized that I hadn't yet seen all of the rooms on the ground floor. As I had been eager to look for the nursery upstairs, I really felt like I needed to leave, but that stubborn part of my mind stopped me. I made my way through a few small, nondescript chambers without finding much. But then in one of the last unexplored rooms, I saw her. Look, this is still hard for me to think about, much less type out. The memory is so vivid. I've spent the past 6 years trying to forget what I saw that night, and now I'm recalling it. And the image hasn't faded at all from my mind. All right, I'll do my best. And I came around a corner into a new room, and as my flashlight beam swept across the wall, I saw her face. The dead grandmother's face, I swear to you. It was only there for a split second, but it was so clear. I know I didn't imagine it. Her skin was mottled gray, blackened in some patches. Wrinkles and cracks covered every inch of exposed flesh. Her eyes bulged out, but they were pure white, as if covered in a thin film. Her lower jaw hung slack, but not in a way I'd ever seen before. It was as if her jaw was dislocated or outright broken. A few small, jagged teeth sat around her gaping maw, and a swollen tongue was visible between them. Her white hair clung to her scalp, in patches matted and stained. She wore an expression that I can only describe as desperation, almost as if she was pleading for someone or something to save her from her awful fate. I really only got a good look at her face, but I also glimpsed her upper body. And while I can't be sure, I think she was clutching something in her wizened hands. A bundle. It was about the size of a small child. As soon as I saw her, I screamed. I screamed louder than I ever had before. Or since, come to think of it. You know that feeling of pure, absolute, all-encompassing terror? Fear so powerful that it numbs you while at the same time making you hyper-aware of everything around you? Some of you will know what I'm talking about. I dropped my flashlight and ran. I ran through the house, now completely dark without my flashlight. I tripped and hit a couple of door frames, but remarkably I seemed to remember the way out, even in my state of total panic, because I was outside in about 10 seconds. I just kept on running now with the moonlight to aid me. I'm not sure exactly when I stopped screaming, but by the time I saw the outskirts of the town a little while later, I was merely sobbing. I ran to the first house that had lights on and pounded on the door. A bewildered man opened the door and I ran inside, nearly collapsing on the ground from exhaustion after running so far. My mad dash for town had left me with more than a few scratches and bruises. When I calmed down enough to speak, I told the man I needed to use his phone. He still didn't really know what was going on, but he led me to the telephone in his kitchen. I'll skip the details. I got a ride home with my father. Despite his repeated questions, it took me weeks to tell him what had happened. He was pretty upset that I had broken into an abandoned house, and to this day, he doesn't believe that I really saw old Nan. Whatever, I wouldn't have believed it either. It was months before I could get a full night's sleep again, and even today I have nightmares about that dead, pitiful face staring out of the darkness at me. And though she made no sound when I saw her that first night, in my dreams she screams and wails. They say that memories of important or traumatic events are far more vivid than memories of mundane events. I guess that's true. I'll remember that face until the day I die. Harass me as I just speak, I don't blame you if you don't believe me. But I'm not the only one who's seen her. There are a handful of other unlucky people who have gone into her house at night. I've heard a rumor that someone even snapped a picture, which is online somewhere. I don't know about that since I never searched for it. I never want to see old Nan again. You're awoken from a dreamless sleep by a dull thud from the hallway. Your eyes snap open and fix instantly on the door. What made that noise? Breathing hard, fear beginning to twitch in your mind. You realize with a shiver that you've kicked your dovet off in your sleep. You quickly grab it, pull it around you, and unconsciously begin to tuck it around yourself tightly as you curl up, leaving no part exposed. You become a warm, safe ball. coiled, leaving only a small gap between the duvet and mattress, so you can see out. Pillows becoming shields between your head and the wall. You are briefly reminded of your childhood hiding from imaginary bogeyman, but this feels more palpable, more dangerous. Another thud. This time it seems louder, deeper, coming from just outside. Trying to keep calm, you run through all the things it has to be. The pipes in the wall, which have been groaning for weeks now, with ever-increasing frequency and urgency, they're never this deep or this loud. The blind in the bathroom left to flap by an open window. You double-check all the doors and windows each night. Perhaps it's your parents returning late and drunk their way. Away on a cruise for another week. Your cat prowling through the house at night, you put it out that evening. Despite all your desperate reassurances, you feel the fear turn to panic and you pull the duvet tighter around yourself, reducing your field of vision to a thin chink. Another. The loudest yet, just inches from your door. Your churning brain conjures images straight from your childhood nightmares. Masked psychopaths, giant spiders, shape-shifting creatures. Amalgamations of bone and gristle twitching their way across the floor, scrabbling with twisted limbs for the door handle, then scuttling in with a burst of speed, claws grasping for your quivering body. Another. Your breathing is hoarse and shallow now, mere gasps to suddenly dry throat. Lungs closing up, stomach churning and roiling, eyes wide and fixed. Your blanket is still tucked vice-like around you. Your body pinioned underneath its futile protection, just inches of cotton between you and whatever is about to burst in. Eyes burning, talons gleaming dully to claim its prize. Suddenly, in a flash of realization, you realize what the source of the noise is. The old, falling apart bookcase in the corridor? One of the legs must have given way, and the tilt is tipping books one by one onto the floor. As you listen carefully, you can hear the quiet riffle of the pages as another tumbles to the ground. There ought to be one last thud, and yes, silence once more descends, and with it, a soothing calm. As you sink back into sleep, you glance around the room, still snugly cocooned, seeing the vague shapes becoming defined as your night vision improves. Your desk, chair, and television all emerge out of the murk, imposing good, sane reality on the void of night. Then, just before you shut your eyes, you see something that makes the bottom of your stomach drop away into nothingness. There, on the floor, is your duvet. Your screams are muffled. Everything. All of this chaos and madness all began with the black fog. It was just an ordinary day when the news reported a strange phenomenon, a wispy black cloud of fog steadily making its way toward the west coast of the country from over the ocean. Nobody really cared at first, as you'd expect. It wasn't hurting anyone, except maybe the sailors and planes flying over the ocean, but life for everyone else continued as normal. Whenever the news would talk about what we now know as the black fog, people would nod, show mild interest, say something like, "Oh yeah, that's interesting," and be done with it, until the black fog hit the west coast. Cities on the seaside were the first to be hit and covered with the black fog. The news went crazy, every station frantically pointing their cameras at the fog to capture footage of the unique event. Personally, it always looked like a thick cloud of smoke to me instead of a city covered in fog. The news said that nobody from the outside world could contact anybody in the fog. A nationwide panic was beginning, and it grew fast. People who had previously disregarded the black fog now looked for ways to leave the country as the news reported that the black fog was still heading east as though determined to devour the entire country. With mass hysteria of this magnitude, it can safely be assumed that plenty of doomsday prophets came forward with explanations about the fog's origin. It quickly became obvious to me that these prophets of the apocalypse were nothing more than crazies who walked into the news stations from off the streets. Nearly every scenario imaginable was told as a reason for the black fog's existence. God's wrath on humanity, the apocalypse, aliens seeking a safe place to land their spacecraft. The black fog was simple fog mixed with pollutants in the air. It was a publicity stunt for a new movie. It was the government using the fog for some purpose. The WHO was rising, we heard everything, but none of the theories seemed to make sense. There was a few more days of chaotic news reports, and then the black fog came to my town. I was walking home that fateful afternoon, turning a street corner to see my two-story home come into view down the street. Cars breezed past me at a steady pace. Coming toward me down the sidewalk was a mother pushing a baby stroller, with an enthusiastic little boy running ahead of her, cheerfully telling his mommy to hurry up. The grass was bright green in the warm summer atmosphere, and there were only a few white clouds in the sky to distract from the wild blue yonder above. A red car, the sides splattered with a thick mud, raced past me. The bright yellow orb in the sky beamed down on the world, covering us in sunlight. If there's anything I remember from that day, it was the colors. Suddenly, out of nowhere, A dark giant stood up over the horizon and loomed over the city, blotting out the sun. Here stopped in the middle of the road, leading other cars to crash into them. People began to scream. Some hysterical woman wailed, "It's here," as I looked up at the black fog blotting out the sky. It swept over the city quickly, shrouding me in a cave of blackness. I stumbled through the fog, unable to even see my own two hands in front of me. The world around me looked as though it were covered in smoke, but I could breathe in it normally. I heard people screaming, the sound frightfully clear. There was the screeching of tires as cars snapped and the crunching of metal as other cars crashed into each other. In my mind, I could picture the street as it had been before the fog hit. My house was a few yards down across the street. If I could find my way inside, I could wait the fog out and see if it would disappear and leave the city. I began walking toward my house uneasily. Still hearing people cry out for help, it was as though I had become blind. I took my steps with care and tripped over a blunt object when I was halfway across the street. I climbed to my feet with my sense of direction disoriented. How close to my house was I? I just gave it my best guess and made my way forward. I had to walk around a parked car, and after tripping over the curb and falling onto the sidewalk on the other side of the road, my shoes felt grass beneath them. I wasn't entirely sure if it was my yard. I worked my way to the front door of the house and sighed in relief when I realized it was mine. I hurried inside, quickly closing the door behind me. The fog hadn't gotten in my house, which I was thankful for. Only a little of it got in when I opened the door, but I could still see. The windows displayed nothing but black. It was as though I was standing in my house at night, a starless, moonless night. I sat down, took a few deep breaths to calm myself, turned on the TV, and began to watch the news. If anything was being done about the black fog, surely they would have reported it. The news anchors were calm, but to my dismay, they had nothing to report. They said the black fog was perfectly natural and explainable. They said that the entire nation was being covered at an unbelievably quick rate, and the president had been evacuated for his own safety. That is, I changed the channel right there, cutting off a blonde newswoman mid-sentence. On the new channel, they weren't calling the fog natural. They weren't talking about the president. They weren't pretending this wasn't a national emergency. Instead, they were panicking. People who looked like normal civilians ran around the station in a frenzy, while the camera's view rested on a guy sitting behind the news desk, sitting in the middle of all the chaos. He stammered as he spoke, trying to maintain order somehow. There were no reports of rescues from any seaside city, nor did the black fog show any sign of receding, the guy was saying. As I watched, he managed to stop one of the frightened civilians and asked him to say a few things for the camera. "Hi, my name is Adam." Adam began breathing heavily. "That shit out there is crazy, man. Like, it ain't fog. It's something else." Adam wiped off his sweaty forehead and cleared his throat. "We heard rumors that you can see in the black fog if you have a flashlight. Or fire. We sent a guy out into the fog with one of those big-ass flashlights. He hasn't came back yet." I remained in my living room, in complete disbelief that this was happening. I barely registered anything the news said, not that it said much. The only thing they could talk about was the black fog, and because nobody knew anything about it, there wasn't much to say. I couldn't tell if it was day or night outside, so I tried to sleep according to the clocks in my house. I slept on the hardwood floor in the living room, too weary and afraid to climb upstairs to my bedroom. When I woke up, I immediately turned the TV on again. Beside the news station, there were sleeping people mixed with people, standing off camera, who were in rapid discussion about what to do. It was as though they had forgotten the camera was on. I decided to wait and see if they were going to give any piece of news that was worthwhile, and went into the kitchen to fix myself something to eat. Fortunately, I had made a trip to the grocery store the day before it all started. Despite this, my appetite still wavered when I looked at the food. The black fog didn't feel real to me. Almost like some kind of demented nightmare, but it still hurt to think about. I returned to the living room without eating anything and sat down on the couch and stared at the TV. After staring at the screen and listening to the people in the news station talk for an hour, I groaned. Survival was boring. I turned my head somewhere from where I sat curiously. I think Adam had said something about being able to see in the black fog with... I jumped off the couch and stumbled over to the hall closet. After shuffling through coats and other miscellaneous things, I found a flashlight. Clicking it on, I sighed in relief when a bright beam of light shot up. The first light I'd seen since it all started. I pointed the flashlight toward the living room window and froze when I saw a face outside. There was a man standing outside the window with his thin nose barely touching the glass. His face was horrible, yet I couldn't look away. The skin hung loosely on him, making him look like an old man. He had long silver hair on his head, a few strands of which were dangling limply over that face. but also huge bald patches. The worst part about the man was that he was smiling at me. He had a wide toothy grin, but his eyes had black irises and white pupils. Near the bottom of the window, I could see that he was wearing a torn up white shirt, but his smile hypnotized me. His eyes burned into mine. There was no color to the man at all. Even the thin cuts on the sides of his face were an inky black. He was nearly completely unmoving, only moving the slightest bit as he breathed. The light from the flashlight didn't seem to affect him at all. I moved closer to the window and rapped my fist on the glass, but the colorless man only stared. I turned the flashlight off, and the man disappeared in the fog. I turned the light back on, and he was visible again. Adam was right. It was possible to see in the black fog with a flashlight. I was intrigued by the colorless man, but also very frightened. How long had he been outside my window? A shiver ran down my back when I realized that he could have been watching me sleep. I was unnerved by his endless staring and amused smile. As much as I wanted to watch the news in the living room, I instead found excuses to stay out. I found myself looking through the same pantry in my kitchen for almost half an hour. Soon after, I found myself sitting alone in a chair in my room upstairs, quietly thinking about when the fog would lift. But I couldn't stay out of the living room forever, and I eventually went back. The first thing I did was flash the light at the window to see if the colorless man was still there. He was, and didn't seem to have moved at all since I had first realized he was there, and settled. I turned off the flashlight to conserve the batteries, but also so I wouldn't have to look at him, made myself comfortable on the couch, and turned my attention to the news where Adam was talking. Things in the black fog are everywhere, he was saying, because the fog is probably covering the whole world by now. Stay vigilant, a miracle has to happen soon. It seemed that I wasn't the only one who had detected the presence of the things in the fog. Adam delivered reports of mutilated bodies found in the streets with their eyes in their mouths and their teeth in their eye sockets. More of the news station's survivors chimed in behind him with more information and told of strange thumps outside safe shelters where people were holed up waiting for it to end. There was no denying it. Something unnatural was in the black fog, maybe something beyond the colorless man outside my window. I decided to sleep upstairs in my bedroom that night. I shined the flashlight at the window before trudging upstairs to see if the colorless man had left. He was still there, only his eyes had moved to follow me. Once I had gotten upstairs, I placed the flashlight under my pillow, kneeled next to my bed, and did something that I hadn't done for a long time. I prayed. That night, I dreamed that the light had returned to the world. Families walked down sidewalks, children shouted to each other as they played. The grass was a dark green and the sky burned blue. The wind was crisp, gently caressing my cheek as it passed by. I looked around in wonder, and then noticed somebody standing behind me. I whirled around to see the colorless man standing there with that same grin on his face. Only this time, there was no glass separating us. I woke up sweating. The first thing I saw was my bedroom window. Out of curiosity, I took the flashlight from under my pillow and pointed it at the window, my thumb flicking the switch on. I don't know what I was expecting to be there. I was probably thinking that the colorless man would somehow be outside my second-floor bedroom. Something was out there, but it wasn't him. This time, it was a woman with pale skin and long black hair. But she looked younger than the colorless man, probably in her 20s, but she still had the same crooked grin, the same vacant eyes, and the same unsettling stare. She was also completely drained of color as well. I immediately fell off my bed and screamed as the colorless woman stared on. I crawled to my feet and slammed my bedroom door closed as I hurried out into the hallway. As soon as it had shut, I noticed another window in the hallway. I flashed the light at it and gasped when a fat colorless man came into the light, grinning as though laughing at a private joke. I didn't know what to do. Total panic seized me, causing me to flee from the unseen eyes in the black fog. I shined the flashlight at every window I came across. I found another colorless woman in the guest room window and a thin, colorless man looking into the upstairs bathroom before I managed to reach the stairs. I practically flew down them and dived into the kitchen where I ducked under the table and tried to catch my breath. Out of the corner of my eye, I could see the kitchen window. As much as I didn't want to know if one of them was there, I still flashed the light at the window. This one was the worst one yet. He resembled a wolf with a wide snout, shaggy black fur, and pointed ears, and he stared at me with wide, hungry, pupilless white eyes. For a crazy moment, I thought it must have been a wolf's skull or mask. But then a thick dog tongue slid out his mouth and licked his chops as he continued to gaze at me. There was a colorless person at every window in my house. I realized. I stumbled out of the kitchen to get away from the starving eyes of the colorless wolf and found myself standing in the living room. I flicked the flashlight on and pointed it at the window to see that the colorless man was still there. patiently waiting. As I stared, his grin widened and revealed fangs like razors in the back of his mouth. His eyes flashed red, the first color I'd seen since the black fog had arrived. And then the flashlight died, leaving me alone in the dark. As I stood there blinking in the utter blackness that surrounded me and pressed in from all sides, something began tapping on the living room window. As if in response, the colorless people began tapping on every window in the house. The sound was maddening, completely in unison and growing louder. More frequent as every second crept past, and I've been listening to them ever since. All of them just tapping on the windows, the sound never leaves, never stops, never pauses. Listening to that endless noise, I just know that it's tearing my mental state in half. I don't know how much longer I can take this. I just heard a window break. I hope to God it isn't the wolf.
The cat walked slowly across the concrete, pausing to lick its paw in the middle. It sat there in the moonlight, just watching the skies and heavy rain. The clouds swirled, and the night was young. Perhaps it could find a confused mouse, or a drowned frog in this time. Its tail moved with anticipation of its hunt. A chain-link gate swung open with surprising speed, startling the cat, resulting in a hissy fit. The man who opened it carried no thought of the terrible weather, cat, or of anything else he was up against. Yelling an obscenity, he ran as fast as he could through the opening. That thing wasn't getting him, no way. He sprinted through the gate, and into the alleyway. He didn't know why, and he didn't know how, but something was following him. His first inclination was when he kept seeing this menacing figure at every turn. No matter where he went, he kept seeing it. He had thought that it might be a person following him at first, but that had quickly changed when he saw the height and shape of the being. Great, a fork in the alley. Mark sped towards the right, not because of any good feeling, but because he knew whatever it was would catch up no matter which way he went. The figure always seemed to be 2 steps ahead of him. Every time he turned around, it was there, silent as the night, just watching him. He could never make out its features in the rain, as it blurred his vision. He could tell it was tall, and seemed to have black and white skin, with the black covering the legs and torso. He had figured since it didn't move when it was being watched, he could look at it and just keep it frozen. It worked. But when he stared at it, he felt sick. Like something was clawing its way out of him. His worst memories resurfaced in his brain, among them an embarrassing date, a lost pet, his sister's funeral. He had turned away, and crawled for a few seconds until he could stand up again. Then he ran far from the creature, the thing that, like his memories, he could not seem to escape. Suddenly Mark slipped on a giant puddle, interrupting his thoughts. Immediately, his jeans and hoodie became soaked on contact. Picking himself up from the water, the feeling to look back was too great. He turned around. There it stood, as real and frightening as ever. What really startled him was that it was closer because of his tumble, only a mere 20 feet away. Trying not to scream, in case that triggered a reaction from the creature, he spun around and ran. The rabbit may not know of the fox, but it will sense danger when it presents itself. This was not unlike the feeling he felt right now. He didn't know what it was, or why it wanted him, but he felt in his genetic memory that this thing was a great threat. If this thing was chasing him, it had probably chased other people, which meant that nobody had gotten away from this thing ever. Or else they didn't live long afterward to tell the tale. Mark ran out of the alleyway, and into the street. The rain had been coming down hard, he knew that, but until now he hadn't realized how much. The street was overflowing with water, it was even coming onto the sidewalks. A flash flood. He wasn't really surprised nobody was out, even if it was New York. With this weather, everyone else would be inside closed and locked doors, leaving him alone with. Realizing his mistake, he threw himself into the street. While turning around, the figure had come to a stop about 10 feet from where he was. Then he went under the water. It was a little surprising being underwater in a city street, but at least it wasn't deep. Finding a hold in the asphalt, he pushed himself up and out of the water. Looking around, he found that the street was going uphill or downhill depending how you look at it. This meant that there was a slight current in the water, not enough to pull him away, but enough to make him unsteady. Mark looked around, frantic about the creature's whereabouts. In the pouring rain, he couldn't see 10 feet in front of him. If the creature really wanted him, then he was about as vulnerable as he could have possibly been. Looking around, he finally spotted it about a yard away. This close, and in the rain, it looked like something out of a horror movie. It stood around 8 feet tall at first glance, but as he tried to find its head, it just seemed to get taller, like an endless ladder. Looking closely at it, he noticed that what he had originally thought was skin was actually a formal suit, complete with a tie. It was both comical and terrifying at the same time. Much like a clown, it took an ordinary object and perverted it, twisting it into something. Sick, upon even closer inspection, he realized it was far from perfect. It had large rips in the tie, and one sleeve was torn off about halfway up. It had many tears in the fabric, and was stained with several foreboding rust-colored spots, but when he finally found its face, he screamed. It wasn't that there was no face, but it was just so horrible that his mind immediately erased the image from his head every second he spent staring at it. He literally could not remember what it was. But it terrified him beyond belief. Snapping himself out of his trance, he moved to the right, narrowly avoiding a tentacle. How had he missed that? Ducking, he closely evaded decapitation from another. Remembering the current, he threw himself down the street, being swept away with the current down the hill. The entity did not follow. Floating down, unable to get a grip, Mark just tried to stay up on his boat while sliding. Looking ahead, he found to his horror that the creature was already at the bottom of the large hill. Using his feet to steer, he sped himself towards a lamppost on the sidewalk. Reaching out, he attempted to grab it, only to find himself falling, grabbing the edge of the sidewalk as to not be swept in. He realized there must be an open sewer grate below him, unseen in the water. Cursing, he tried to pull himself up. Looking to his right, he spotted the figure about 60 yards away now. Gripping the concrete, he tried to heave himself up. Another quick glance to his right. 20 feet away. Giving it up, Mark let go and fell with the water. After 4 seconds of terrifying free fall, he hit the ground. Hearing a crack and experiencing extreme pain, he moved his left leg. It felt fine, then the other. Once he moved it, he felt incredibly intense pain at the base of his thigh. That meant it was his hip. Shit, trying to stand up. He found he couldn't. The pain was too unbearable. He started crawling, knowing he had to get away. Dragging himself across the ground, he came to the sewer canal that carried rainwater and gunk under the street. Looking to his left, he thought he saw a light. He couldn't tell, as his vision was blurry. Funnily enough, it got cloudier. Then the sick feeling started again, along with the memories. Realizing his fate, he tried to drag himself into the canal so he could drown. Surely it would be a more peaceful death than whatever this being had in store for him. Right as his body fell in, he felt a tendril grab him by the ankle and lift him out of the water, flipping him right side up. He hung there, looking at the creature for the first time, face to face. He was filled with unimaginable terror. Its body radiated evil, and he vomited from the sickness, again and again. Then he felt 2 claw-like fingers lightly position themselves on his eyes. He tensed up, realizing what it was about to do. The woman opened her apartment room window, looking out into the rain. She had thought she heard screams, but there was silence but for the rain now. There was no point looking outside anyway. There was nothing to see. The rain must have been coming down very hard. As it became, she thought about her mother, and the familiar sadness washed over her. She turned away from the window. Sitting down by the lamp, she began to read a book. Looking up slightly, she was startled to think she had briefly seen the faint outline of a man outside her window, but that was impossible. Her room was on the 5th floor of the building. She laughed at her absurd thought. Then she saw the other shadow standing next to her own.
The thing in the back seat. It was the night after Karen turned 16. She had begged her father to let her get a car for her birthday. After hearing her ask again and again, he finally gave in and said yes. They drove to the used car lot right after dinner. Karen had gotten her driver's license just that afternoon, and she drove her father's large sedan cautiously down the road. They had agreed that the car should not cost much, and that it would not be too sporty or fast. Secretly, Karen hoped that she might find a bright red car, maybe even a convertible, and convince her father to buy it. But she was willing to settle on anything he agreed to buy. After all, what she really wanted was a set of wheels to give her freedom. Freedom to drive away from home and speed down the road with the wind blowing through her hair. As soon as they drove up to the lot and parked, Karen jumped out of the car and started to walk up and down the rows of used cars. She couldn't help but feel disappointed. Most of them were family cars with 4 doors, dull colors, and no personality. She couldn't imagine herself behind the wheel of one of these cars, but she kept trying to tell herself that any car was better than no car. The salesman came up to her father and started to ask questions. A crooked smile came over his face as he listened to what they were looking for. Then, with a flourish of his arm, He waved them toward a brown sedan that had orange upholstery with plastic seat covers. Karen cringed and tried to pull her father away from the car, but he seemed intent on listening to the salesman's pitch. She crept away from the car, deciding that she wouldn't be caught dead in it. She backed into a red convertible that had a price tag that was 10 times what her father had promised to pay. Still, she couldn't resist slipping into the driver's seat. The minute she gripped the wheel in her hands, she knew it was the car she wanted. Then she looked through the windshield and saw her father's frowning face coming toward her. Quickly, she jumped out of the car and walked toward him, not whispering a word about the convertible. For another hour, they followed the salesman around the lot as he showed them one car after another. One was too expensive, another too ugly, the next too run down. Karen began to despair of ever getting a car. She walked away from her father and the salesman and started to wander toward the back of the lot. It was the only place she hadn't looked yet, and she was feeling desperate. Then, like a miracle, she saw the car. It was dark red, something like the color of dried blood, but just bright enough to look sporty. It wasn't a convertible, but it was sleek and low and had the kind of style she liked. And, best of all, the price was just below what she and her father had agreed on. Karen slipped behind the wheel and settled into the leather bucket seat. The minute she put her hands on the steering wheel, she knew it was the car she had to have. Suddenly, she saw the salesman walking briskly across the lot toward her, shaking his head. "No, no, no," he said emphatically. "You do not want that car, young lady." "Why, I'm afraid you're wrong," she answered just as firmly. "It's exactly the car I want." Her father came up then and saw her sitting behind the wheel. She noticed the smile that spread across his face when he saw the price tag on the car. Well, why haven't you shown us this beauty before?" he asked the salesman. "Listen, everyone who buys this car brings it back," the salesman said. "Trust me." Karen met her father's eyes. She knew that something about the car had caught his fancy as well. Right away, she went to work convincing him that she should have it. Her father opened up the hood and looked at the engine. As far as he could tell, the car was in perfect shape. "I think we'll buy it," he told the salesman. "I can write out a check tonight." "You're just wasting your time," the salesman said. "Everybody who buys this car brings it back." Karen and her father didn't pay any attention to what he said. They paid for the car and Karen drove it off the lot. All the way home, she kept the windows down so the wind could blow through her hair. She felt free, even though the wind was cold and stung her cheeks. The next day after school, Karen grabbed her set of car keys and ran out to the car. She jumped inside and took off on a road that led out of town. It was a brisk autumn day, and when she rolled down the windows, she became chilled by the Ecole breeze. Reluctantly, she rolled the windows up again and drove on. Before long, she began to notice a strange smell. It seemed to be coming from the back seat. The longer she drove on smelling that smell, the sicker she felt. It was a sweet rotting smell, a disgusting aroma that reminded her of graveyards. Karen suddenly didn't feel free anymore and quickly turned the car around to go home. The next day, the same thing happened. She had to roll the windows up because the weather was so cool. When she did, the whole car began to reek with the rotting smell from the back seat. This time, Karen decided to keep driving, even though the smell bothered her. As she went on, the smell got worse and almost seemed to be alive in the back seat. She glanced up at the rearview mirror, and there, staring back at her, were two evil eyes. Karen screamed and whirled around to look in the back seat. But nothing was there, just the horrible smell. The next day, Karen decided she wouldn't take a drive in her new car. Then her mother asked her to go on an errand to the next town, and Karen was too embarrassed to admit that she was afraid of the car. So she climbed behind the wheel, rolled down the windows even though it was freezing cold out, and started to drive. For several miles, it seemed that nothing was wrong with the car at all. Karen almost started to feel the sense of freedom again that she'd first experienced when she sat behind the wheel. Then, when she was all alone on the country road, the smell began. It grew and grew until it filled up the back seat. Then Karen took courage and looked into her rearview mirror. The evil eyes were there again, staring at her. They narrowed as she met their gaze. Karen started to scream. Just as she did, a hand reached from the back seat and grabbed her shoulder. She whirled around. But there was nothing there. Karen slammed down on the brake, and the car screeched to a stop. As she threw open the door, she felt the hand from the back seat grab at her neck. She looked up into the rearview mirror, and the eyes were there, leering at her. With all her strength, she pulled loose and jumped from the car. She ran all the way home, trying to escape the thing in the back seat. The next day, Karen and her father took the car back to the lot. The salesman shook his head when he saw them. By evening, the car was back in its place at the rear of the lot. The thing in the back seat was there, too, waiting.